in this last session of this morning, we're going to hear from Steve Smith from East Carolina University of North Carolina on the guiding instructions through these teaching transitions and best practice that you've gathered so far. So many thanks for joining, and the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Thank you and welcome everybody. I'm glad to be here today. As was noted before, I'm Steve Schmidt, Professor of Adult Education at East Carolina University. And some of my research looks at teaching transitions. And so I'll be going over a little bit of my research and sharing some conclusions, some best practices, and those types of things. So, everybody can see me and hear me, and we're ready to start.
Yeah,
Okay. Okay, so when we look at teaching transitions, probably the most common one that we're all familiar with, especially now because of COVID, is transitioning from face-to-face to online teaching. But we also, there have been also teaching transitions in the works, up to COVID, before COVID, because a lot of universities and a lot of colleges were moving from face-to-face to online instruction anyway. So that transition was taking place before COVID. COVID just moved everything forward really quickly, but we started looking at this idea of teachers making transitions before the pandemic. And we also realized too that in higher education, in the workplace, in a lot of places, there are other transitions being made. We're moving from more traditional instructor-led courses to more student-centered courses. We are moving from more passive learning, where the students sit in the instructor lectures, to more active learning, getting the students involved in their learning, doing activities and doing projects and things like that. So there have been all these transitions going on all along, but there are some reasons that I'll talk about in a little while for why they're happening more so now. Also important to note is that transitions are happening everywhere that there are teachers, pretty much. They're happening in higher education, they're happening in the workplace, many other types of venues. So it's not just limited to higher education that teaching transitions are happening. Now there are a couple of reasons for the transitions that are, okay. There are a couple of reasons for the transitions that are okay that we're seeing now, and here are a few examples here. The increased popularity of online education. Again, that was happening before the pandemic, but that moved really quickly during the pandemic. Changes to traditional models of education. We see that in a lot of different venues. In the workplace, for example, we used to have organizations would bring employees in from around the country or around the world to face-to-face training sessions. Now with online teaching, we found that we can do it just as effectively with everybody staying in their own country or in their own office and logging on to an online session. So there are some economics involved here. Increases in technology are allowing us to do this all much more effectively, as demonstrated by this meeting today that is both face-to-face and hybrid. So changes in technology have certainly meant that there have been transitions in teaching. Let's see here. There are changes to traditional models of education as well. Some research I did in the skilled trades area, some skilled trades are moving to more learner-centered approaches, and they're moving to face-to-face learning in laboratories as opposed to traditional classroom settings. A lot of what apprentices used to learn on the job, they would learn by shadowing an existing worker. But existing workers don't have time to do a lot of that training anymore, so because they're busy working on their own projects. So changes in traditional models of education because of these types of things are important as well. Other things we are finding that we're finding that, as I mentioned, there are other models of education are more effective, and we're focusing much more now on what the learner is learning So evaluation and measurement are becoming much more important. And I'll talk about that more in just a second, but that's another reason for this transitioning to these methods where we can more closely evaluate what each individual learner is learning and what each individual's learning process looks like. And then, of course, the big one, the COVID-19 pandemic, that moved everybody online very quickly. So lots of reasons for these types of transitions. Now, when I said that there's more focus on measurement and assessment and ensuring the learner is learning what they're supposed to learning, you might be asking yourself this question here: why haven't we been doing this all along? Which is a good question. And a lot of it, I believe, comes in the way we used to be measuring or have been measuring things versus how we're measuring them now. I think there's more, I think there's more focus on results. We used to measure education in terms of time spent in it. So you would do a 3-hour course. An undergraduate degree is 120 credits. We would measure success by the length of time you spent in something. Now there's more of a focus on measuring success by, can you do what you're supposed to be doing at the time? Maybe it takes some people 100 hours, maybe it takes people 20 hours to learn to do something. But there's much more of an emphasis now on demonstrating competence and demonstrating that you've learned something, rather than, yes, I spent 5 hours doing this, with the assumption that you might be learning something. So that, I think, is one of the reasons why this idea that evaluation and assessment is more important nowadays. I see that as a shift from more traditional ways of looking at education, just in terms of time spent. Okay. Another reason for this question is we kind of get caught in teaching cycles. And this is something I see very often in my research. This is, you probably all can relate to this. First of all, we have to acknowledge the fact that change is hard, and we're not very good at making change. And so we typically learn to teach the way we were taught. Okay, and that's pretty typical. That's often how we learn to teach. And I have been working with our medical school at East Carolina, and I love this quote by a medical school faculty member who said, "I know I'm not a great teacher, but I don't know what to do to get better at it." She was taught this one way of teaching. She didn't know any other way to do it. So we typically teach the way we were taught. We develop courses based on the courses that were developed for us. But the problem now that we're seeing is many institutions are asking teachers to teach in ways that they were never taught as learners. And our generation, I think, here is really the only generation that falls into this category of, many of us never had an online course as a learner, but we're expected to teach an online course. Now, the earlier generations, they did face-to-face learning, and they are doing face-to-face teaching. Generations in the future, they will all probably come into teaching with probably a mix of face-to-face and online experience as a learner. So they'll have experience in both. But we're in this strange place here where we're the ones making the transition, and we may not have any experience teaching face-to-face as a learner we may not have experience as a learner in an online situation, but we're being asked to teach in an online situation. So we don't have a lot to go on here. We don't have a lot of models. There were no behaviors to observe. Now we understand that there are different skills involved with teaching online than there are teaching face-to-face. We may not have those skills if we've never taught online. And we have to move very quickly because things like COVID happened, things like every semester there are more and more institutions that ask their instructors to move more and more of their classes online. So there's more and more pressure for instructors to move online and start teaching online, even though they may not have any experience doing it. So this kind of is the cycle that we see happening a lot. And to add to the pressure, the clock is ticking because we needed to do it right away. In the case of COVID, we needed you to do it in about 2 weeks because most people had very little time to move their classes online. So this is the situation that we see happening now. Our research focuses on what are the best ways of helping instructors make these transitions in their online teaching, or making transitions from more instructor-centered to more student-centered. Questions that we looked at in our study were what types of learning activities are helpful for instructors learning to make these transitions, and what areas should be considered when professional development opportunities are being developed for these instructors. And the thing that's important to remember here is when we make transitions in our teaching methods, and the first presenters talked about this a bit, which I thought was important. When we make transitions in our teaching methods, the role of the instructor changes. And so we have instructors moving from the traditional roles of lecturer to more facilitator. There are more guides or coaches rather than presenters. Whereas we used to be instructors who would stand up and lecture. Now, if we are moving a course online, we have to have instructional design capabilities. We have to have technology expertise. We have to know how to reach all those learners online, which is different than reaching all those learners in a face-to-face environment. While this is going on, relationships shift. There's a sense of status that we associate instructors standing in the front of the room talking to people. When they're working with the learners on this, guiding them next to them, it's a little bit different status. The relationship between the student and the teacher is a little different. And then there's the idea of self-perception and capabilities. Many instructors are very concerned about making these kind of transitions. Can I do it? I've never done this before. And it's often presented to them as a kind of a flippant thing, like, okay, just take your face-to-face course and move it online, like that. How many of us have heard that? Just take your face-to-face course and move it online, just like nothing. It's presented in such a simplistic way that it's certainly not the way it is when you have to take a face-to-face course and put it online. So these are a lot of concerns that instructors have had about making these changes, and as a result, there's a lot of fear about making changes. Again, lack of knowledge, like the self-doubt about competence. Can I do this? Negative attitudes toward these proposed changes. I mean, for a long time, when we talked about moving courses from face-to-face to online, so many instructors said, "Oh, my course could never go online. I could never move my course online because of the topic or because of this or that." So all of these things have resulted in a lot of hesitancy and fear on the part of the instructors, and that has come out in a lot of ways. Questions about is online education really education, for example. Those kind of fears kind of manifest themselves in these things you see here. So when we looked at the research study questions, and this is a combination of a result of several studies we did on instructors making transitions. We came up with 4 different themes for things that would be helpful for institutions, whether they're workplaces or institutions of higher education, helping instructors make these transitions. And they fall into these 4 topics: professional development, smaller focused training, informal learning, and self-directed learning. Okay, so we'll talk about each of these. Just want to make sure I'm good for time here. Okay. With regard to professional development topics, what we found was not helpful to many people was professional development that focused only on the use of technology. And a lot of respondents pointed out that there's a difference between understanding how to use technology and understanding how to teach in this situation. And so many institutions, to address the move to online teaching, for example, sent their faculty members to courses on how to use the technology, how to use technology like Canvas and Blackboard and things like that, or how to use different technology tools. And this was found to be not as much helpful because these people were there to learn how to teach online. So we found, again, too much focus was on the use of technology, and too little focus was actually on pedagogy or andragogy of teaching using the specific method to be implemented. Too little focused on how do I actually teach people online? How do I actually teach people in an active learning situation? Things like that. How do I design curriculum so that my traditional lecture notes, which probably aren't useful anymore, how do I translate those into notes that I can use to guide and coach learners through this assignment? Okay. There was also too little focus on practicing what instructors will be doing as well. It was mostly traditional instructor-led types of things. Often, sadly enough, instructor-led types of things where the instructors were not really instructors, but technology experts. So not even really teachers. So again, this was a finding related to topics associated with professional development. What also wasn't helpful were large group training sessions run in the case of our respondents at the higher university level. Big group sessions that focus on moving your class online, for example, or topics related to making these transitions. What was helpful were smaller group sessions run at the department or at the college level, or sessions that focused on teaching online in a particular discipline. So if you teach anthropology, for example, getting a group of anthropology teachers together to learn how to teach online in their specific discipline. That sort of thing was much more helpful than a broad university-wide training session where people from all over campus teaching different disciplines were learning to teach online. So the smaller and more focused and more related to your individual discipline, that sort of thing was helpful. Now, what we found was most helpful and most effective for instructors making transitions was informal learning, or small group or small mentoring sessions, informal conversations, learning in small pieces. We had one group that did like 5 or 10 minute professional development sessions after each staff meeting. They would go over the use of maybe a technology tool. They would go over something related to the transition they were making. In short spurts of education that they could take and actually practice in their classrooms. Okay. Informal conversations and the development of informal teaching groups. Several of the people that we worked with in our study kind of developed their own teaching groups with people in their disciplines, colleagues in their departments. They would meet, maybe once a week to start with, once a month. Each one of them would share what they're doing, something new, what they're trying, how it's working, what they might do differently next time. So these like informal lunch kind of gatherings and stuff like that. Those types of things were very helpful. And the idea that getting small pieces at a time was helpful, because ultimately what we found with our research was that when transitions were being made, when instructors were trying new things on like moving to online teaching, trying something online, it was best and easiest, and they learned best when they started small. So you take one aspect of your class and you maybe put this online and see and do it right in the classroom, but have the students pull up their laptops and do it online. Try one small active learning activity if you're moving from more passive to active learning. Try a 5 to 10 minute activity. Evaluate, see how it goes, and then build on that. That was really the most effective way when you have time to do these types of things. Start small, set low expectations, but do the activity, gather the feedback, and use that to build. and then talk about it with your informal group. Okay. Now, opportunities for self-directed learning were also noted as being helpful by these folks making transitions. But the caveat here is these opportunities for self-directed learning were helpful after the participants had a general baseline of knowledge. Putting opportunities for self-directed learning out there, whether or not they're video clips or small things to read or manuals or diagrams, things like that, without that base knowledge were less helpful. But for people who have that base knowledge and wanted to add something to what their existing repertoire of methods, this type of thing was helpful. So having access to resources, opportunities to try products, meaning new technology, or maybe lab activities and things, opportunities for exploration on behalf of the instructors. So they can go in and try something first and then move it into their classrooms. So again, these types of things were good, but not as the very first steps. Okay, so some overall transitions. I think we don't spend enough time on this because we're so busy looking at the transition and we're so focused on what the new way of teaching is going to be. But I think it's so important to acknowledge that transitions are difficult for all of us. They're difficult for teachers, just like everybody else. It may take some time. You may see that hesitancy and that difficulty manifest itself in the critique of the new, or criticisms of the new way to do it, or I'm not going to change because I don't need to change, things like that. I've always done it this way. It's always been effective. But I think it's really important to acknowledge that change is difficult for all of us. It's hard to change your teaching style, especially when you don't know what you're getting into. And acknowledge that up front. I think acknowledging that up front goes a long way toward having a successful change. Focusing more on curriculum development and pedagogy of online teaching, maybe a little bit less on technology, also be helpful, and offer professional development through a variety of channels, more smaller, more focused, shorter sessions, and providing opportunities for folks in like areas to develop their own networks so they can then work together with each other. We were pleasantly surprised that a lot of people in some of these classes that they took did develop their own informal networks, and they kept those networks going throughout, for longer than the school year in our case. So they do stick if you get the right people in the right group. All right, so in kind of a summary, making transitions, always the initial feelings of worry or apprehension were present. The sense of role ambiguity and confusion. Again, what is my role as a teacher if I'm not standing up in front of people teaching? So acknowledging that and helping people move into their new roles. Struggling to master new methods was a problem for everybody to start with. But again, we have to acknowledge up front, you may try something and it may not work. So you can try something else. Acknowledge the fact that we may not do everything right the first time. But the motivation to succeed, and this was pretty standard from our respondents in our study I'm talking about here, they were motivated to succeed because they didn't want to let their students down. They didn't want they didn't want to fail because they had an obligation to their students. That really was the driving factor in much of this idea that, okay, this is not going well, but I got to keep going and I got to keep trying and I got to keep working at it. It was the motivation to succeed based on concerns for the student. Now, and the good thing that we found too is as instructors matured and as they got more familiar with the new way of teaching that they're working on, they really kind of blossomed. They could focus more on individual student needs. They could run a variety of different activities at the same time, rather than just one at a time. They could do much more multitask type of teaching. They could focus on ways to improve communication. They could be more creative. They could meet the needs of many different learners much more effectively, which kind of goes back to the first presentation of this session, whether or not they're introverted or extroverted. they had many more tools in their toolboxes. And so, the good news, as I always said, is, we as teachers can be taught just like everybody else. And it was really nice to see this, once they got over those initial learning curves and the hesitations and things like that. A lot of them really just blossomed, and they got very excited about, well, okay, what can I do now to keep making this better? So a few implications to start out with, or to conclude with, what this study means. A better understanding of the experience of making these transitions helps us to prepare future educators, and kind of helps us develop a roadmap for making transitions, in this case, how to teach online or how to teach in more active learning environments, giving us some guidelines for both what to do and what may not be the best things to do. Okay, and that's it. Any comments or questions? Thank you. Thank you.
Fascinating. I think you've spoken to all of us in your findings and in this problematic. We'll open the floor for comments. You would have to come here so that the online recording captures.
Thank you. Thank you for your talk. One way we have found to remove some of the technology pressure from the professor is to put a team of support. We have a producer, a graphical designer. We even tried makeup for some time, but that didn't work. But to have some group of support people, have a factory that can be shared among many professors to help them. That reduce the risk of the technology for the professor, and then let them concentrate on the content. Have you seen that somewhere else, or have you seen any of that support team help?
Yes, and that's a great point, and I've seen some of that. It really has depended on the situation with the folks that we worked with on this study. Some of them had great technology support, and as you said, the huge benefit of that was when we looked at all the different jobs that the online instructor has, taking one thing off their plate helped them to focus on the curriculum development or the other things. So yes, that was very helpful. The more they got of that sort of thing, the more helpful it was, because it really alleviated one big concern from them. But we didn't see where it was. Some people had better experiences than with others. It wasn't consistent among all the people we talked to in our study.
Yeah, go ahead. Shall we leave the mic on the desk so we all don't touch it anymore?
Okay.
So I think it's audible. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
My question for you is, who is leading the faculty developments in either where you're at or with the experiences you've had? And the reason I ask is because where we're at, we have basically a committee of faculty that lead faculty development. There's great value that can come from that, but the instructional designers are not involved in that faculty development. And we feel like it would be very helpful if we were. So I'm just curious your comments on it.
Yeah, so I'm at East Carolina University, as I said. We have an Office of Faculty Development that was mainly in charge of that. Now, the Office of Faculty Development for us will sometimes pull resources from like our instructional design department or program. We have a master's in instructional design program, or from our adult education program when they want subject matter experts to work with these larger groups. And so I think they are pretty good about that. But the problem we found with having the office like that in charge of this was the issue that it was the training was too general, and people in their individual disciplines didn't get as much out of it because it was not related to how to teach history, and I'm a history teacher, or how to teach math, and I'm a math teacher. So that was the case there. So they had been involved, but it didn't seem to be as helpful.
There is a participant asking about the recommendations, so we'll just broadcast it. She missed the last recommendation, but it's now. Do you want to elaborate perhaps on the last recommendation? So there was a question about it.
Sure. The offering professional development through a variety of channels. This is kind of, I guess it relates to like a I don't know, course catalog kind of approach, where rather than saying, okay, everybody's got to go to this session to learn how to teach online, it's offering options. It may be a smaller, more focused session on this particular subtopic of teaching online, or this subtopic. And maybe there are, rather than a 2-hour session, maybe it's a half an hour session on how to learn this aspect of teaching online. And also, so it's when I say variety of channels, I mean smaller, more focused training on specific areas that people can take and use right away and try out right away. Also, as an offshoot of these types of things, always encouraging, I guess, the development of networks and learning communities. Now, this kind of happened on its own during some training sessions that we interviewed students about, or instructors about, where they'd be in one of these small group sessions. They struck up a conversation with somebody or two, and from that, like, a network would develop informally. But that network ended up being very, very helpful, much more so than a lot of other things offered formally. So that's what I mean by provide opportunities to develop networks.
Thanks so much. And Audra Senft is asking that now that the world is starting to opening up, we've seen instructions to give up on online learning. So would you have ideas to help encourage them to keep on trying? And what would you suggest, your best ideas on this?
Well, I would say I'm glad they tried it, first of all. I'm glad they gave it a shot. And we never know what's going to happen with regard to face-to-face or online, or any method of education going forward. So at least if they tried it, maybe they'll be a little less hesitant the next time, if there is a next time when we'd have to move classes online or courses online. Because again, who would have thought we'd been in this position 2 years ago? So I think this pandemic, and we saw it in our school, the real diehards who were never going to teach online, and often they were the more tenured faculty members who had more choices, so they didn't have to, they could teach what they wanted when they wanted to teach. But when everybody had to move online, I think a lot of the people who didn't think they could ever teach online or put their classes on, they didn't have a choice. And so at least they know that they can do it now. So I think that's something.
Really, really interesting. Any more questions from the room here or online? Yeah, I think it's also, we see, so over the pandemic, we've been hosting like 150 learning topics on public health online. And now it's when the world is now opening up a bit. So all the science technical teams of the World Health Organization want to start producing the online learning into face-to-face sessions. So we have the reverse problem.
It's another transition.
Yeah,
yes.
Exactly. And then it's that now you can't, it doesn't work so that you used to take your old face-to-face slides, dump them online. Now you want to extract the dumped PowerPoints and reuse them again in completely non-functioning formats for the face-to-face. So this is the kind of where the theory of adult education science methods for different suited learning formats come into play. And I think we need more people like yourself to speak for the case that it is not to dump your stuff somewhere online as such. No. And it's really a scientific effort to design in a way that it meets the learner needs in different channels and formats.
Yeah, it really belittles the process to say just dump it online.
Exactly. Or
so much
extract it back and dump it elsewhere.
Yeah.
Exactly. Okay, super many thanks, Steve. This was a great discussion, and we shall continue over the lunch. And thanks for the whole 2-hour session. And that's been an exchange that has been really important and thrilling to follow as a group here and also online. So many thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.